Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the shadows of the Victorian era, where candle flames flicker against damp stone walls and carriages rattle faintly over cobblestones slick with mist. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and horse sweat, and you can almost hear the distant hiss of steam engines in the night. You feel the weight of a great empire at its height, velvet curtains, marble halls, iron railways. But behind that polished veneer lurk mysteries that never found their neat endings. You probably won't survive this, not because of a knife-wielding maniac in Whitechapel, but because even the most comfortable feather mattress can't protect you from drowning in the riddles of Victorian history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, I'd love for you to post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fun to see this strange global midnight club we've got going. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start naturally with a royal mystery, because no one in the Victorian age commanded more attention than Queen Victoria and her beloved consort Prince Albert. Their marriage, in a time when love matches among monarchs were about as rare as a public restroom that didn't terrify you, was unusually affectionate. Albert wasn't just a handsome German prince dragged into duty. He became a cultural force, shaping British taste towards science, industry, and a stern moral code that somehow managed to make trousers and table manners feel like instruments of empire. But in December 1861, Albert suddenly fell ill. The official diagnosis was typhoid fever. It sounded respectable enough. Contaminated water, poor sanitation, the sort of diseases that haunted even royal palaces. Typhoid was the perfect culprit. Invisible, indiscriminate, and already infamous in London's poorer quarters. Yet as you lean in closer, you notice something odd. Albert had suffered chronic stomach issues for years, details glossed over in official bulletins. He had complained of abdominal pain, fatigue, and recurring illness long before this sudden decline. Historians still argue whether he truly died from typhoid, or whether the diagnosis was a polite fiction for a far messier truth. Some suggest Crohn's disease, others stomach cancer, and of course, fringe voices whisper about poisoning, because nothing spices up history like the possibility of arsenic in a teacup. Imagine the scene. Albert pacing Windsor Castle, clutching his stomach, fever breaking his once proud composure. Doctors, more skilled in Latin than in actual medicine, hovering with leeches and patent tonics. Some recommended wine, others a mustard poultice. You get the sense that modern antibiotics could have saved him in a week. But in 1861, medicine was still a blend of science and superstition. If you trusted your doctor, you were basically signing up for experimental theatre. Victoria's reaction to his death transformed not just her family, but her entire empire. You picture her cloaked in black, every mirror in Windsor covered, her heart locked away like a tomb she would never open again. Her mourning was so total it practically turned Britain into a Gothic stage play. Black crape hanging from windows, portraits shrouded in shadows, newspapers running endless columns of sentimental verse. She demanded her children dress in mourning, her servants whisper through corridors, her court reflect her grief in every gesture. It's one thing to lose a spouse, it's another to impose a decades-long funeral procession on an empire supposedly built on progress and optimism. But here's where it gets stranger. Just before his death, Albert had confronted their eldest son, the future Edward VII, about a scandal involving an actress. The rumour went that Albert had travelled to Cambridge to chastise Bertie for his behaviour. Within weeks, he was ill and bedridden. Gossip spread quickly. Had stress and heartbreak broken him, or had he caught something suspicious while travelling? Some even muttered that Bertie himself had brought dishonour, and perhaps contagion, into the royal home. Not the kind of Christmas dinner conversation you want immortalised in history. Quirky detail for you. Albert's death sparked a boom in mourning merchandise. Shopkeepers sold authentic Victoria black dye to help common folk match the Queen's sombre style. Whole businesses thrived on grief. If you couldn't afford expensive crepe fabric, you bought cheaper soot-coloured muslin, because heaven forbid you should show up to church without properly commodified sorrow. Victorians could turn anything, railways, funerals, even heartache, into a booming market. And let's not forget the spiritualist craze. Séances were already fashionable, but Victoria herself reportedly consulted mediums, hoping for messages from her lost husband. You picture her seated at a table, candles flickering, a spirit rapping on the wood. Was it Albert reaching across the veil, or just a servant with a clever foot? Historians still argue whether her belief in these sessions was genuine, or just the desperate grief of a widow who refused to move on. Either way, it added a ghostly sheen to an already mysterious death. Albert's absence also reshaped the monarchy. Victoria withdrew from public life, rarely appearing in person. Crowds who once adored her grew restless, muttering about a recluse queen who preferred her seclusion at Osborne House to ruling in London. Politicians filled the vacuum, and the monarchy itself began to drift towards ceremonial status. So in a way, Albert's ambiguous death marked not just the loss of a man, but a turning point in royal power. You lie back, blanket tucked under your chin, and consider the layers. Was Albert undone by bacteria, by chronic illness, by stress, or by something darker still? The official story is neat. Typhoid fever, December 14th, 1861. But the whispers refused to die, much like the widow who wore black for 40 years. You can almost hear the clocks ticking in Windsor, each beat a reminder that even in the age of empire, death could arrive in riddles no physician or queen could untangle. And that really is how you begin your walk through Victorian mysteries, not with a slashing knife in Whitechapel, but with a royal cough behind velvet drapes, an illness that may or may not have been what the doctors claimed, and a queen whose sorrow became a national costume. You pull your blanket closer, because if even princes can vanish in the fog of medical uncertainty, what chance do the rest of us have against the mysteries of this shadow-draped age? You step from Windsor's sombre halls into the gaslit streets of Whitechapel, where fog curls like a living thing, and horse hooves strike the cobblestones with weary rhythm. The year is 1888, and the world's most infamous whodunit is about to unfold. You tug your coat tighter, because this isn't a stroll through the royal parks. It's a walk into the hunting grounds of Jack the Ripper. The city smells of coal smoke, cheap gin, and something less pleasant you'd rather not identify. Narrow alleys twist between decaying buildings, whole families crammed into single rooms, with crime and desperation as common as soot on your cuffs. This is where the Ripper prowled, choosing victims from women already pushed to the margins of society. The newspapers called them unfortunates, but really they were just women trying to survive nights colder than your fridge's back panel. Between August and November 1888, at least 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were murdered with chilling precision. The killings weren't the sort of vague misfortune Victorians were used to. These crimes were brutal, surgical, and left bodies posed in ways that made even hardened policemen faint. You picture a young constable stumbling out of a blood-stained room, trying not to lose his dinner of mutton pie. Mainstream fact here. The press frenzy around the Ripper murders basically invented modern tabloid journalism. Illustrated papers published lurid sketches, maps of Whitechapel, and letters supposedly written by the killer himself. "Dear boss," one infamous letter began, taunting the police with promises of more horrors to come. Most historians agree the letters were hoaxes, likely the work of journalists trying to boost circulation, but that didn't stop readers from gobbling them up like gossip about the Kardashians. Fringe tidbit? Well, some Victorians genuinely believed Jack the Ripper wasn't human at all. Pamphlets circulated suggesting he was a demon, a vampire, or even Spring-Heeled Jack, that leaping bogeyman who had terrified London decades earlier. Because when in doubt, just blame it on a supernatural caped villain. You lean closer to the flickering lamplight, because the theories about his identity never end. Was he a failed medical student, a butcher, or even a royal surgeon? Historians still argue whether Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, could have been involved. That particular theory is more conspiracy fantasy than history, but it's stuck, probably because people love mixing royalty with scandal. Others suspected foreign immigrants, Freemasons, or even women disguised as men. Scotland Yard, bless them, never managed to make a convincing arrest. Their files swelled with notes, witness contradictions and frustrated scribbles. Picture the investigators, detectives tramping through damp courtyards, lanterns raised, boots slick with mud. They interviewed pawnbrokers, pub owners, cabmen, and dozens of frightened witnesses. Every lead collapsed. Witnesses contradicted themselves, describing men with different hats, moustaches, or coats. By the time police traced one man, another suspect had already been named in the press. It was like Victorian Pokemon, but instead of collecting creatures, you were collecting suspects who'd never pan out. The Whitechapel residents lived with daily terror. Women refused to walk alone, men patrolled corners with cudgels, and yet life had to go on. People still queued for bread, still argued over rent, still tossed dice in smoky pubs, even as whispers of the Ripper rippled through every conversation. You can almost hear a man mutter into his pint, "They'll never catch him, you mark my words." Here's something quirky. The Ripper panic actually inspired fashion. Ladies in wealthier neighbourhoods carried murder cloaks, thick wool capes designed to protect them if attacked, as if layers of fabric could fend off a knife. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs sold Ripper alarms, tiny rattles that women could shake to summon help. They probably made more noise than protection, but hey, Victorian ingenuity at work. And then there was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the canonical five. Her murder in Miller's Court was the most horrific, the one that finally made even the ghoulish press recoil. Police reports describe the scene in grim detail, but you don't need to picture it to know it marked the crescendo of fear. After that, the murders seemed to stop, or at least no more match the Ripper's precise style. Did he die? Was he arrested for some other crime? Did he simply grow tired of his grisly hobby? Historians still argue whether Jack's tally was 5 victims or more than a dozen, hidden among London's endless unsolved crimes. As the fog curls around you, you realise the greatest mystery isn't who Jack the Ripper was. It's why the world remains so fascinated. Other Victorian murderers were caught and forgotten. But Jack, faceless and nameless, became a kind of dark folk hero. He haunted novels, penny dreadfuls, and eventually the movies. Even now, scholars publish new theories every year, each certain they've solved the puzzle, none able to silence the others. You step back from Whitechapel's shadows, a little colder than before. The echoes of boots on cobblestones fade, but the unanswered question lingers in the damp London air. Somewhere between fact and fear, Jack the Ripper still prowls, an unsolved riddle you'll never quite leave behind. You think you've left Whitechapel behind, shaking off the fog of Jack the Ripper, but the London night doesn't loosen its grip so easily. The gas lamps sputter, their halos of light wobbling in the mist, and then, there it is again. A scream. Not the drunk laughter kind you'd expect spilling from a tavern, but something sharper, pierced with disbelief. You pause mid-step. Something is wrong. Someone has seen something they can't explain. And here, in the 1830s, those explanations grow legs faster than a rumour at a family reunion. Welcome, then, to the era of spring-heeled Jack. London was ripe for monsters. The Industrial Revolution had packed the city with more people than its narrow medieval streets could ever handle. Smoke choked the air, poverty rubbed shoulders with palaces, and everyone was just a little on edge. Into that tense atmosphere slipped stories of a figure leaping impossibly high over fences, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that glowed and breath that flickered blue flame. You picture yourself on a dark street, boots slipping in the muck, only to look up and see a silhouette landing on a rooftop like a Victorian Batman. Except instead of saving you, he's reaching for you with claws. The earliest reports surfaced in 1837. A servant girl named Mary Stevens claimed she was attacked while walking through Lavender Hill. She described a figure that leapt out at her, gripped her tightly and clawed at her clothes. Neighbours heard her screams, but by the time help arrived, her assailant had vanished, apparently by leaping away with unnatural ease. A week later, he supposedly struck again, springing in front of a passing carriage and terrifying the horses so badly they nearly killed the driver. This wasn't just mischief. It was theatre with a cruel edge. By 1838, the city was buzzing. The Lord Mayor himself, Sir John Cowan, addressed the phenomenon at a public meeting. Citizens had flooded him with letters describing encounters, all painting a similar picture. Tall, cloaked, devilish features, long claws, and jumps that defied explanation. When a politician is forced to publicly acknowledge your existence, you've officially moved from rumour to cultural panic, mainstream historical fact. The incident that truly cemented Spring-Heeled Jack's legend involved Jane Alsop in February 1838. She lived on Bearbinder Lane when a man knocked at her door claiming to be a policeman. He said he'd caught Spring-Heeled Jack and needed a light. Dutifully, she handed him a candle and immediately regretted it. The man threw back his cloak, revealing glowing eyes and a helmet-like head. He spat blue flames into her face and tore at her with metallic claws. Jane's screams brought her family, and the figure fled by leaping into the darkness. The newspapers devoured the story, and Jack's reputation was sealed. Fringe tidbit. Some contemporaries insisted Jack wasn't a man at all. Theories ranged from the supernatural, he was a demon sent to torment sinners, to the extraterrestrial. A few pamphlets even described him as a visitor from another world with advanced technology. If that feels too sci-fi for Victorians, remember, this was the same century that gobbled up ghost stories, mesmerism and phrenology with equal enthusiasm. For Londoners already primed to believe in things that went bump in the night, a flame-spitting, spring-booted monster was just another possibility on the menu. Quirky aside, Spring-Heeled Jack became so infamous that cheap theatres staged melodramas about him. He leapt across trapdoors and onto balconies to the delight of packed houses. Penny dreadfuls transformed him into a gothic anti-hero, a sort of proto-supervillain long before comic books. Children, never ones to pass up mischief, even dressed as him for Halloween-like pranks, chasing each other down alleys with makeshift masks and candle stubs. Imagine being terrified out of your corset only to discover it's just the neighbour's kid in Dad's overcoat. but not all encounters could be waved away as childish games. In April 1845 in Limehouse, a teenage girl named Lucy Scales was reportedly attacked by a cloaked figure who breathed fire into her face, leaving her temporarily blinded. Her testimony, repeated in court, gave the story fresh life. If it was a prank, it was a cruel one, and it suggested someone was willing to risk real harm to keep the legend alive. Historians still argue whether Spring-Heeled Jack was one man, a series of imitators, or simply a moral panic magnified by the press. Some blame an eccentric nobleman named the Marquess of Waterford, known for wild pranks and cruelty toward women. He was nicknamed the Mad Marquis, and his reputation made him a convenient suspect. But the timing never quite lined up, and he died in 1859, while Jack's sightings continued for decades afterward. Others point to bored aristocrats with access to experimental technology, perhaps boots rigged with springs or chemicals that could mimic fire breathing. But how do you test homemade flamethrower shoes without ending up in traction? Soldiers too claimed to see Jack. In 1877, a sentry at Aldershot Barracks swore that a strange figure bounded toward him, slapped him across the face with a cold, clammy hand, and then leapt away unharmed, even after the guard fired his rifle at point-blank range. The bullets, he insisted, simply bounced off. You can imagine the laughter in the pub afterward, but also the sleepless nights. By the 1870s and 1880s, reports stretched as far as Liverpool. Yet as the century turned, the sightings dwindled. Was it because London changed, its shadows pierced by electric light and police reforms? Or did the original prankster finally retire, leaving his legend to the imaginations of penny dreadful readers? Historians still argue whether Jack was flesh and blood or simply the embodiment of a city's fears. Fear of crime, of the unknown, of a metropolis expanding faster than anyone could control. And so, Spring-Heeled Jack lingers on the edge of memory. You picture him now, a cloaked figure crouched on a rooftop, eyes glowing like embers in the fog, ready to spring into the night. Was he a demon? A prankster noble, or London's first urban legend brought to life by the press? Whatever the truth, he leaps forever in imagination, suspended mid-air, never quite landing, never quite explained. You leave behind the rooftop leaps of Spring-Heeled Jack, but the sense of unease lingers, like a smudge of soot on your coat that won't brush off. The gas lamps gutter, and you drift toward quieter, more aristocratic neighbourhoods, where the cobblestones feel smug and the houses peer down at you through polished windows. Here, mystery takes a different shape. Not claws and flames, but the sudden, inexplicable vanishing of men who should have been too wealthy, too connected, too important to simply evaporate. You're walking into the strange world of Victorian disappearances, and one of the most baffling involves the upper-class circles that gave rise to cases like the Vanishing Nobleman, who paved the way for Lord Lucan's more famous escape a century later. Victorians loved gossip almost as much as tea, and nothing fueled their imaginations like the scandal of a gentleman gone missing. In the 1870s, newspapers buzzed about aristocrats who vanished, often leaving debts, broken reputations or family quarrels behind. Picture the scene: a lavish dinner party, silver polished to blinding shine, servants tiptoeing with tureens of soup, and then, suddenly, the host himself disappears. His creditors pound at the door the next morning, his horses stand neglected in their stables, and the only clue is a half-finished letter on the desk. Mainstream fact. One of the most infamous disappearances of the period involved the case of Lionel Sackville West's brother, who vanished under murky circumstances after financial ruin. While his name never carried the lurid infamy of Lucan's, It set a template. Nobility could vanish just as easily as a factory worker, and their titles offered no protection from mystery. But Victorians didn't always buy the mundane explanations. Fringe tidbit: many suspected that vanishing aristocrats had joined secret societies or fled across the seas under assumed names, perhaps resurfacing in the colonies. Some swore they spotted missing lords tending sheep in Australia or running gambling houses in New York. Historians still argue whether these sightings were hopeful inventions or genuine reappearances in new guises. After all, once you ditch the top hat and the title, you're just another man with sideburns and questionable habits. Quirky detail: Victorian creditors often treated a debtor's disappearance like a treasure hunt. Auctions would be held at abandoned estates where gawkers could buy silver spoons, crested bed linens, or even monogrammed chamber pots once belonging to the vanished. Imagine sipping your tea and realising your neighbour bought the missing Viscount's old nightshirt at a bargain. It turned tragedy into a sort of middle-class shopping spree, and yet the disappearances kept happening. Some were likely suicides, concealed by embarrassed families who preferred whispers of a disappearance to the stigma of self-destruction. Others may have faked their own deaths to escape ruin, slipping onto steamships bound for America, where no one cared about unpaid debts to London bankers. In a society obsessed with reputation, disappearing was sometimes the only way to preserve a shred of dignity. You picture one such nobleman, coat collar raised, boarding a ship at Tilbury docks under a false name. He stares back at London's skyline, smoky and sprawling, and decides never to return. Back home, his family stages a delicate silence. Servants claim ignorance. The press speculates wildly. And years later, someone swears they saw him in Calcutta or Cape Town. Historians still argue whether such tales were urban myths or tantalizing glimpses of truth. The press loved it, of course. Disappearances made perfect serialized stories. The Vanished Peer became as juicy a headline as any murder trial. Illustrators sketched silhouettes of well-dressed men stepping into the fog, captions promising readers that the full mystery would be revealed next week. Spoiler, it never was. It was Victorian clickbait before the click had been invented, and the public couldn't get enough. Middle-class readers relished the thought of a baron or viscount disgraced, undone by debts or vices. It was comforting, in a twisted way, to know the upper crust could crumble just as easily as a labourer evicted from a tenement. You imagine pub-goers slapping their knees, chuckling, "Serves him right, the pompous fool," while secretly peeking over their shoulders, wondering if they too might one day vanish into the fog. Some families even encouraged the disappearance narrative. Better to let society believe a relative had mysteriously vanished than admit he'd been caught embezzling funds or cheating at cards. Respectability mattered more than truth, and mystery could be a convenient mask. That's why so many cases remained unresolved. No one wanted them resolved. The unanswered question was safer than the ugly answer, but the human imagination has a cruel streak. Once a man vanished, his story grew beyond his control. Was he murdered by enemies, spirited away by gypsies, lured into an underground Masonic ritual gone wrong? People whispered every possibility, feeding on the thrill of not knowing. And here's the eerie part: you still don't know. For all the genealogies, archives and family papers left behind, many of these Victorian disappearances remain unsolved. Historians still argue whether the missing lords were victims of foul play, desperate fugitives, or willing ghosts who chose to walk away from their names. You tighten your blanket as the polished houses fade into shadow. Somewhere out there, In the misty reaches of empire, a man with a title may have shed his skin and started over, while back in London, his absence hardened into legend. The fog swallows his footsteps, and you're left with nothing but questions. The aristocrats vanish into the fog, but your steps draw you now toward a different sort of darkness, one lit not by mystery alone, but by the greasy glare of gas lamps reflecting off damp cobblestones. Ahead, you hear the echo of hawkers calling out headlines, boys darting between hansom cabs with broadsheets waving in the air. Their shrill cries pierce the evening. The Bermondsey Horror! Read all about the dreadful crime. Even the name clings to the air like soot, as if it was coined precisely to stain your imagination. The Victorians didn't just witness crime, they branded it, sold it, and replayed it in every parlour until it was as familiar as the weather forecast. It was the year 1849. Bermondsey, already foul with the stench of tanneries, glue-works and stagnant Thames water, suddenly carried another odour, the pungent reek of scandal. The tale unfolded in a cramped house where ambition, jealousy and desperation boiled together. At the centre was Patrick O'Connor, a wealthy moneylender whose flashy dress and ruthless lending practices made him both envied and despised. Entangled with him was Sarah Gale, soon to be Sarah Manning, described by neighbours as striking, clever and determined to climb above her station. Add to this volatile mix Frederick Manning, Sarah's husband, a railway guard with brooding eyes and a temper like coal dust waiting for a spark. The bare historical fact is chilling enough. On the evening of August 9th, Patrick O'Connor was invited to dine with the Mannings. Imagine the table set neatly, roast duck steaming on a platter, port shimmering in the glass, silverware polished to a shine. You picture O'Connor leaning back, smug and unaware, while Sarah and Frederick exchange furtive glances. Then, violence. O'Connor was struck, shot, and stuffed beneath the kitchen flagstones. Lime heaped over his corpse in a clumsy attempt to smother decay. It was a crime born not of sudden rage but of deliberate planning, but the Victorians, never content with mere facts, embroidered the story with fringe details. Whispers spread that Sarah Manning had consulted a fortune-teller days before the murder, seeking omens of success. Some swore she stitched talismans into the seams of her gown, believing protective charms would shield her from detection. A few even claimed she had muttered incantations over the dinner wine. Historians still argue whether these fragments emerge from actual testimony or from penny press invention, but the rumour alone transformed Sarah into something more than a murderess. She became a figure of almost Gothic menace, half femme fatale, half witch. The discovery of O'Connor's body triggered a frenzy. Police ripped up the Mannings' kitchen floor, and newspapers published lurid illustrations of the corpse under stone. Crowds surged to Bermondsey just to stand outside the murder house, gawking like pilgrims at a shrine of horror. Enterprising vendors seized the moment, selling hot pies, gingerbread and even chunks of rubble, marketed as pieces of the true floor. You can almost hear the carnival barkers shouting, "Get your bit of the Bermondsey Horror, only a penny a stone." It was grim commerce, but in Victorian London, tragedy and tourism walked arm in arm. Both Sarah and Frederick fled, but separately, like conspirators who forgot their pact the moment blood was spilled. Frederick headed toward the Channel Islands, Sarah to Edinburgh, where she was soon caught. Recognised, some said, because of her stylish clothing and aloof manner. Even on the run, she carried herself as though she were far too refined to blend into the crowd. Her arrest became spectacle itself, with crowds gathering at stations just to glimpse the infamous woman in custody. The trial was sensational. Sarah dressed elegantly in court, her black eyes fixed on the gallery with disdain. Reporters hung on every word, sketching her features as if she were a tragic heroine. Frederick, by contrast, sulked and blustered, portraying himself as a man led astray by a domineering wife. The jury, however, saw through both performances, convicting them with little hesitation, and then came the execution. On November 13th, 1849, the Mannings were hanged side by side before a massive crowd, some estimated over 50,000 souls. Men, women and children jostled for a view, climbing lampposts, perching on rooftops, elbowing one another for position. Vendors sold beer, buns and souvenir prints. The air was thick with a carnival energy that horrified onlookers like Charles Dickens, who attended and later denounced the spectacle as brutal and degrading. He described the crowd's drunken glee, its coarse laughter, its indifference to human suffering, and called for an end to public hangings. Yet Sarah Manning remained the focus. She had chosen to wear black satin on the scaffold, gleaming even in the weak November sun. The press seized on the detail, painting her as a macabre vision of defiance, a woman who refused to bow to shame. Eyewitnesses disagreed about her final expression. Was it icy contempt, or was there a flicker of fear? Historians still argue which version rings truer, but in either telling, her death seared itself into Victorian memory. Here's a quirky postscript. Strands of the hangman's rope were snipped up and sold to eager buyers. Some believe they carried magical properties, able to cure headaches, ward off theft, or bring luck at cards. Imagine some gentleman slipping a grimy bit of rope into his waistcoat pocket before a night at the gaming table. In a society obsessed with both rational science and occult superstition, it made perfect sense that death could be recycled into good fortune. The Bermondsey Horror became more than a crime. It was a mirror held up to Victorian society. It revealed the public's insatiable hunger for spectacle, the press's talent for sensationalism, and the uneasy fascination with women who transgressed gender expectations. Was Sarah the cold manipulator the papers claimed? Or was she trapped in a marriage to a violent man, her choices narrowing until murder seemed the only exit? Historians still argue whether she was a schemer, a victim, or a mixture of both. As you stand on that Bermondsey street in imagination, the tannery stink fades into memory, but the echo of the crowd remains. Tens of thousands shouting, laughing, gasping as a woman in satin met her end. The flagstones have long since been replaced, the rope long since frayed, but the questions still hum like a low note in the London fog. Why did she do it? Could she have chosen otherwise? And why even now do we keep retelling her story, savouring the unanswered mystery like a bitter sweet at the back of the tongue? The shouts of the Bermondsey crowd fade into the fog, but now another sound rises to your ears, the rhythmic slap of water against hulls, the groan of ropes straining against moorings, and the faraway toll of a harbour bell. You find yourself at the docks, where the air smells of salt, tar and wet timber. The horizon stretches out into grey nothingness, and it's here that the next great Victorian riddle awaits you, rocking gently on the tide, the mystery of the Mary Celeste. The name alone has become shorthand for ghost ships, but back in 1872 it was not a legend yet. It was a ship with a crew, a cargo, and a destination. She was an American brigantine, solid and seaworthy, captained by Benjamin Briggs, a man respected for his experience and faith. His wife, Sarah, and their young daughter Sophia sailed with him, joined by 7 crewmen. Their voyage from New York to Genoa should have been routine, yet weeks later their vessel was spotted drifting silently through the Atlantic, Sails trimmed, cargo intact, but the people gone. That's the cold fact. On December 5th, the Mary Celeste was discovered by the crew of the Dei Gracia between the Azores and Portugal. The weather was calm, the sea not especially treacherous. When Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gracia sent men aboard, they found the Mary Celeste in surprisingly good order. The hull was sound. The galley still held stores of food, plenty enough to last 6 months. A sewing machine, a harmonium, personal papers, all left behind. Even the captain's log, though ending abruptly, showed no hint of trouble. The only things missing were the lifeboat and the people. Imagine stepping onto that deck yourself. A pipe with ash still clinging to its bowl lies abandoned, as if its owner set it down intending to return in a moment. A half-read Bible sits open on a bunk. Toys rest on the bed where Sophia once slept, tiny relics of a vanished child. You feel as though the crew has just stepped around the corner, but the silence tells you otherwise. Victorians naturally lost their composure over such a mystery. Theories multiplied like barnacles on a ship's hull. One mainstream speculation suggested that fumes from the cargo, 700 barrels of industrial alcohol, might have leaked, filling the hold with a terrifying vapour. A sudden rush of gas, a loud creak, and the crew may have panicked, fearing explosion. They could have abandoned ship in the lifeboat, tethered by rope, only for the rope to snap or be cut in haste. It was rational, but unsatisfying. How could seasoned sailors abandon such a sturdy vessel, leaving meals on the table and 6 months of provisions untouched? Historians still argue whether fear of invisible fumes alone explained such a rash decision. The fringe tidbits were far more entertaining. Some whispered of mutiny, that the crew had murdered Captain Briggs, spirited away his family and fled. Yet there was no blood, no signs of struggle. Others, unwilling to resist a dash of the Gothic, proposed sea monsters, phantom ships, or even alien abduction, though that last one only became popular in the 20th century. One particularly Victorian flourish was the claim that pirates had boarded the vessel. But pirates, famously pragmatic, did not leave valuable cargo untouched. And then there was the rumour that the Dei Gratia's crew had something to do with it. After all, towing the abandoned ship to Gibraltar would net them salvage rights worth thousands. At the inquiry, they were grilled like fish over a flame. Had they murdered the Mary Celeste's crew to seize her cargo? The court found no evidence, but suspicion lingered like smoke, and the story spread far beyond the courtroom. Historians still argue whether greed coloured those early reports more than truth. Quirky detail. Long after the case, people began treating the Mary Celeste like a cursed object. Sailors muttered that any vessel connected with her was doomed. Owners struggled to keep her afloat, literally and financially. Over the years, the ship changed hands, each new master meeting bankruptcy, illness, or worse. Finally, in 1885, her last owner ran her aground off Haiti in a clumsy attempt at insurance fraud. It was a pitiful end for a ship that had once carried the aura of legend, but the legend refused to die. Arthur Conan Doyle, yes, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a fictionalized account in 1884, calling it J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement, and renaming the vessel the Marie Celeste. His tale embellished wildly, adding bloodstains, cutlasses, and dark conspiracies. The story was so convincing that many readers believed it factual, and for years people repeated Doyle's inventions as if they had happened. You could say the Mary Celeste was doomed not only to drift the Atlantic, but also to sail forever through the seas of fiction. The heart of the mystery, though, is its unanswered intimacy. Unlike the Jack the Ripper murders or the grand disappearances of nobles, this was a story of a family. You imagine Sarah Briggs tucking her daughter into bed, humming softly above the crash of waves. You picture Captain Briggs keeping his log, his pen steady, his faith strong. And then you picture nothing, because there is nothing. The entries stop. The lifeboat vanishes. 10 souls slip into the silence of history. Standing on that deserted deck in your mind, you can feel the creak of wood beneath your boots, smell the tar and salt, hear the sails sighing overhead. But you cannot hear footsteps, cannot hear voices, just the hollow breath of wind through rigging. The unanswered question lingers like a foghorn's moan. Why did they leave? Where did they go? And here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive the Atlantic in a small open boat, not for long, but the Mary Celeste still floats in your imagination, eternal, a ghost ship on calm seas, forever searching for her lost crew. The ghostly timbers of the Mary Celeste fade from your imagination, and now you hear another rhythm rising. This time the soft shuffle of boots along a muddy lane, lanterns swinging in the gloom, voices muttering low. You've stumbled into London's East End, where shadows cling tighter than fog, and where, in the autumn of 1888, an unknown hand etched fear into history. The name Jack the Ripper never appeared in the newspapers until the killer himself, or someone pretending to be him, decided to scrawl it in mocking letters. But even before the ink dried, the murders were already sending shivers through Victorian society. Picture yourself trudging down Whitechapel's narrow alleys. The stench is overpowering. Coal smoke mixed with sewage, stale beer and desperation. Men huddle outside gin palaces, their laughter a little too forced. Women in ragged shawls linger under weak gaslight, offering themselves for a few pennies because the choice is simple: sell your body or starve. It was in this world of poverty and hopelessness that 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were murdered with such brutality that even hardened policemen staggered at the scenes. Here's a mainstream fact. The Metropolitan Police had just celebrated 50 years of modern policing, and they were keen to prove themselves competent. Yet the Ripper case exposed their limits. Despite hundreds of officers scouring the alleys, interviewing thousands and following endless tips, the killer melted into the crowd. No fingerprints, no forensics, no CCTV, just the soft crunch of boots on cobblestone disappearing into night. Historians still argue whether the police bungled the case through sheer incompetence, or whether the task was simply impossible given the tools of the time. Now onto a fringe tidbit: the letters. More than 200 were sent to newspapers and police claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. Most are obvious hoaxes, scribbled by pranksters or journalists hungry for circulation. But the Dear Boss letter, with its chilling sign-off of yours truly, Jack the Ripper, is still debated. Was it authentic? Did the murderer truly taunt the authorities with red ink? Or was it clever media theatre, a way to brand a faceless killer with a name that would never be forgotten? Historians still argue whether the Ripper's identity lies hidden in those taunting words. And then there's the graffiti. On the night of the double event, when both Stride and Eddowes were killed, police found a bloodied piece of apron near a chalk scrawl. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Superintendent Charles Warren ordered it erased before daylight, fearing an anti-Semitic riot. To this day, scholars fight over its meaning. Was it a genuine clue left by the killer, or just a random bit of street scribble tragically linked by coincidence? The debate refuses to die, like the echo of a scream muffled in fog. Victorians loved suspects almost as much as they loved gaslight melodrama. Over the decades, the list of proposed culprits has grown absurdly long. A failed barrister, a Polish barber, Queen Victoria's grandson, a mad doctor, even Lewis Carroll, the man who wrote Alice in Wonderland, has been accused. Fringe theories pile higher than chimney soot, but each collapses under scrutiny. Still, the uncertainty is part of the allure. Historians still argue whether the Ripper was a local drunkard with a blade, a medical professional with dark urges, or even multiple killers who together formed a phantom identity. Quirky fact: Victorian entrepreneurs didn't waste time cashing in. Guided tours of the murder sites sprang up almost immediately, lantern-lit walks where curious gentlemen could gawk at the alleys where women bled, pamphlets with lurid illustrations sold like penny candy. Fear became a commodity, printed and sold, a shadow industry that continues today with Ripper museums and walking tours. Imagine booking a guided stroll through fresh crime scenes while the police are still investigating. Victorians managed it. But beneath the sensationalism lies something far grimmer. The silence of the women themselves. Each victim had a story beyond her final night. Nichols once lived in a workhouse. Chapman sold flowers before sliding into poverty. Stride claimed to have survived the sinking of a steamer. Eddowes entertained with ballads in the street. Kelly dreamed of opening a dress shop. Yet in the press, they were reduced to the label unfortunates, their lives erased by the fascination with the man who killed them. You walk the alleys and feel the injustice heavy as fog. How quickly the world forgot the women to remember only the shadow. The mystery, of course, endures because the killer was never caught. The files are thick with names and thinner with evidence. Some theories lean on DNA tests from preserved letters or clothing, but the samples are degraded, the results inconclusive. One year it's a Polish immigrant, the next a royal scandal, the next a conspiracy involving Freemasons. Each answer frays at the edges the moment you tug. And here's your cheeky reality check. If you were wandering Whitechapel in 1888, you probably wouldn't survive long either. Not necessarily because of Jack, but because of the typhus, tuberculosis, or the gin itself. Statistically, disease was the sharper killer, but the Ripper stole the headlines, and in doing so he became immortal. You trudge out of Whitechapel with your collar turned up, lantern glow dwindling behind you. The alleys twist into silence, and you realise the most haunting part of the mystery isn't just the unanswered who, but the persistent question of why. Why these women? Why this frenzy? Why the silence afterward? The fog swallows your footsteps, and the Ripper slips once more into shadow. The smoke of Whitechapel still clings to your lungs, but soon the chimneys rise higher, the night grows darker, and you catch yourself staring upward as though something might leap across the rooftops. And if you were a Londoner in the early Victorian years, you would have sworn that you weren't imagining it. Somewhere above, a figure was said to bound effortlessly from one wall to another, cloak snapping like wings, eyes glowing like embers. They called him Spring-Heeled Jack, and his legend would crawl into the Victorian imagination like soot into lace curtains, impossible to wash away. The first whispers came in 1837, when the city was already anxious about crime, industrial upheaval, and the unexplainable. London was a pressure cooker of soot, sweat, and rumour. So perhaps it isn't surprising that when a young servant named Mary Stevens claimed she was attacked by a cloaked figure with icy claws and a hideous laugh, the story spread. She said the assailant leapt at her from a dark alley, tore at her clothing, and vanished by vaulting over a wall far too high for any man. People chuckled at first. It sounded like one of those Gothic penny tales. But the laughter died when the attacks multiplied. Within months the newspapers were ablaze. Jane Alsop, another young woman, answered her door one February night to what she thought was a policeman. He asked her to fetch a light, for they had caught Spring-heeled Jack nearby. But when she handed him a candle, the figure spat what she described as blue and white fire into her face, clawed at her, and then bounded away. Imagine standing there barefoot on your threshold, clutching a candlestick, when suddenly your visitor turns into a kind of Victorian dragon cosplayer. You'd never answer your door again. A week later, Lucy Scales, just 17, was walking home when she saw the cloaked man step into her path. He again exhaled flame. Yes, literal fire-breathing in multiple reports, and sent her stumbling, half-blinded, into the arms of her sister. The local constables arrived too late. Once again the creature had bounded out of reach. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The assaults were real enough to prompt an official investigation. Even the Lord Mayor of London received letters from terrified citizens describing a monster prowling the suburbs of Peckham, Hammersmith and Stepney. Witnesses gave consistent details: pointed ears, glowing eyes, metallic claws and impossible leaps. Pamphlets warned of him. Families barred their windows. By 1838, Londoners weren't laughing, they were locking their doors. Historians still argue whether these were coordinated pranks by a gang of young aristocrats, young bloods, with too much time and money, or the work of one disturbed individual who enjoyed terrifying the city. Quirky tidbit. Some witnesses swore that Jack wore a kind of oilskin suit, tight and shiny, with a helmet that gave him the look of a devilish soldier. In other words, he wasn't just scary. He was fashionable in a grotesque way, a mix of soldier, demon and stuntman. His image was reproduced in broadsheets with exaggerated claws and leering faces, and before long toy makers sold little figurines of him. That's Victorian consumerism for you. Why simply fear a monster when you can also buy one for your mantelpiece? But it was his jumps that cemented him. Accounts spoke of him clearing 9-foot walls, vaulting 20 feet in a single bound, and escaping over rooftops like some prototype superhero. One policeman swore he chased Jack into a dead end, only to watch him spring up the side of a house and disappear across the chimneys. Today, athletes with spring-loaded stilts manage impressive leaps, but in 1838, if you could jump your own height, people considered you a marvel. Historians still argue whether crude spring boots might have existed, or whether the leaps were embellishments layered onto ordinary assaults. The panic eventually gave way to parody. Punch magazine ridiculed the hysteria with satirical sketches, and travelling shows turned Jack into comic melodrama. Penny dreadful publishers couldn't resist either. Soon, Spring-heeled Jack, the terror of London, was being read by schoolboys under their desks, thrilling to serialised tales where Jack was not only leaping over walls, but fighting bandits and rescuing maidens. Somehow the monster morphed into a folk hero, equal parts bogeyman and caped crusader. And yet, the sightings did not stop. Reports appeared again in the 1840s, when villagers swore they saw the fire-breathing leper bounding across the countryside. In the 1870s, people in Sheffield described a cloaked figure that attacked lone travellers before vanishing with a giant leap. Even into the early 1900s, Liverpool police received calls about a mysterious figure clearing rooftops. Imagine explaining that on your report form. Assailant left scene by jumping over 3-story building. Not exactly standard procedure. Historians still argue whether these later reports were mere copycats or evidence of folklore taking on a life of its own, independent of any real attacker. A fringe theory that gained popularity in the late 19th century suggested Jack was not human at all but something supernatural, a demon sent to punish the wicked, or a fey trickster who had strayed from England's rural folklore into the industrial city. Later enthusiasts, never missing a chance for science fiction flair, claimed he might even have been an alien visitor, his glowing eyes and flame breath the result of otherworldly biology. Realistically, more likely gin-fueled imagination and Victorian sensationalism. But in a world that still half believed in witches and half trusted in steam engines, it was a story that made uncomfortable sense. And here's a reality check for you. You probably wouldn't last a single leap in Jack's boots. Try hurdling a carriage while wearing stiff Victorian trousers, and you'll end up face first in the mud with nothing but bruises and embarrassment. Yet the Victorians kept one nervous eye on their rooftops all the same. You walk down a narrow lane now, hearing your own breath fog in the cold. The gas lamps hiss faintly, their glow barely reaching the upper stories. And though you know it's only your imagination, you almost hear the scrape of boot heels above you, the faint whir of fabric as if a cloak were fluttering against the night. For a moment you wonder if a figure crouches on the chimney stack waiting, eyes glinting red. But when you look up, only smoke and stars. The unanswered mystery of spring-heeled Jack lingers not because of what he was, but because he refused to vanish. Was he prankster or demon, folklore or flesh? You'll never know. But you keep glancing up as you walk, half expecting to see a silhouette leaping across the rooftops forever out of reach. You drift away from the shadowy lanes where spring-heeled Jack once prowled, and soon the soundscape changes. The hush of alleys gives way to the hammer of rivets, the clang of iron against steel, the groan of timbers being bent to a ship's hull. You are at the waterfront, the liminal place where the city yields to the sea. Here, in the damp fog of the docks, you find not phantoms leaping across rooftops, but phantoms of another kind, ships that sailed proudly into history and then dissolved into myth. The Victorian age was one of iron ambition, but it was also an age of loss, for the sea swallowed men and machines alike with an appetite that has never been satisfied. The British Empire lived and breathed through its navy. From Plymouth to Portsmouth, from Glasgow to Belfast, shipyards never rested, hammering out vessels meant to carry troops, goods, and explorers into every ocean. Yet despite progress, steam engines, reinforced hulls, copper-bottom plating, ships still vanished without trace. The ocean, that vast wilderness, refused to be tamed, and the stories of these disappearances spread almost as quickly as the ships themselves were lost, haunting the public imagination with ghostly sails and unanswered questions. One of the most chilling tales begins with HMS Eurydice. It was March 1878 when this training ship, filled with over 300 young sailors, neared Portsmouth. After a long voyage in warmer seas, the men looked forward to home. Families gathered along the coast, watching for the familiar silhouette of the Eurydice against the horizon. But nature had another plan. A sudden snowstorm swept across the Isle of Wight. In minutes, the Eurydice heeled violently, took on water, and sank. Only 2 survivors lived to tell of it. Entire households mourned sons who never set foot ashore again. Yet what lingers is not just the tragedy, but the afterlife of the ship. For decades, sailors swore they glimpsed her ghost, her white sails gliding silently near the Isle of Wight, her rigging creaking though no wind stirred. Even Prince Edward, later Edward VII, admitted to seeing her apparition from his yacht. Such sightings were too numerous to ignore, so the Eurydice became not only a wreck but a legend, a spectral vessel doomed to repeat her final voyage, Was it a trick of fog, a mirage, or proof that the sea cannot always bury its secrets? Then comes the tale of HMS Atalanta, which in 1880 sailed from Bermuda with more than 250 men, many of them cadets in training. The Atlantic swallowed her without warning, leaving no wreckage, no message in a bottle, not even a plank washed ashore. Families clung to hope for months, then years, but nothing returned. Theories abounded. Had she been capsized by a storm? Was she too top-heavy? Her design fatally flawed? Some whispered of mutiny, others of supernatural forces, because she vanished in waters later folded into the myth of the Bermuda Triangle. The Atalanta was eventually tied to wilder speculations. Seas that opened up and devoured ships, magnetic anomalies that confused compasses, whirlpools large enough to swallow whole fleets. No matter how rational investigators tried to be, the absence of evidence left the public mind free to wander into darkness. Victorian newspapers, hungry for readers, stoked the fire. Letters published in the Times warned mothers not to let their sons board Navy training vessels, declaring them cursed. Cartoonists sketched ships drifting into clouds labelled mystery and doom. Sailors, with their taste for yarns, told of phantom bells tolling across waves or disembodied voices calling in the night. A cadet might go to sleep with these stories fresh in his ears, the wood of his bunk creaking like footsteps, the sea whispering through cracks in the hull. Fear is a powerful tide, and it runs deepest when no answers exist. But perhaps the most haunting disappearance of the Victorian seas was the Franklin expedition. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set out with two vessels, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, to chart the Northwest Passage. They carried the pride of Britain with them, steam engines, reinforced hulls, canned provisions thought to last years, and yet both ships simply vanished into the Arctic wilderness. Decades passed before the first fragments of the truth trickled home. Inuit hunters spoke of gaunt, starving men dragging sledges across the ice. Abandoned lifeboats were found with skeletons strapped inside, as if the dead had tried to row across frozen seas. A single note retrieved from a cairn revealed Franklin had died early in the journey, leaving the survivors to struggle on. Later investigations uncovered clues almost too grim to contemplate. The exhumation of 3 sailors revealed astonishingly well-preserved bodies, locked in ice since the 1840s, their skin and uniforms intact. Testing showed high levels of lead, likely from improperly sealed canned food. Some scholars argue it was lead poisoning that slowly robbed the men of their strength, leaving them unable to fight starvation or disease. Others suggest scurvy, tuberculosis, or sheer cold did the killing. Darker rumours, whispered even in the Victorian age, hinted at cannibalism, though such claims horrified the polite society that had once toasted Franklin's noble quest. And yet, despite grim evidence, the mystery endured. How could ships so well prepared, so technologically advanced, collapse so completely? Why were no survivors ever brought back? Why did so many artifacts lie scattered, yet so many questions remain unanswered? For Victorians caught between faith in progress and fear of the unknown, the Franklin expedition became a wound that never quite healed. Think for a moment. You, wrapped in your modern coat, would not survive a week in that frozen silence. The Franklin men endured at least 2 winters, wool coats iced stiff, fingers numb even inside fur mitts, the endless night stretching on without sun. In such conditions, the boundary between reality and hallucination blurs. Did some of those sailors glimpse ghost ships themselves, sails lit by the aurora, before falling into the snow forever? As you stand now at the docks in your imagined Victorian night, fog curls thick as wool, muffling the sound of chains. You inhale the tang of tar, salt, and iron. From the corner of your eye, you think you glimpse a three-masted vessel, sails white and gleaming against the dark. She glides silently across the mist, though no tide moves. You blink, and she is gone. Was it only vapour twisting into form, or a reminder that the sea, like the night, keeps its own secrets? Victorian London wrestled with mysteries on land, phantoms leaping over rooftops, and on sea, where whole ships dissolved into silence. Both hauntings sprang from the same tension, a civilization convinced it could master the world, yet endlessly reminded that mastery was an illusion. The sea swallows without mercy, and fog keeps its counsel. The unanswered questions still slap against the pier like the eternal rhythm of waves. You step away from the creaking pier, the salt still clinging to your tongue, and drift toward a softer corner of the Victorian imagination. The fog of vanished ships and drowned sailors yields to a garden buzzing with summer bees, damp with the earthy smell of moss and riverbank mud. Here, the mystery is not about storms or wreckage, but about something far lighter, delicate, translucent, and winged. You bend down, push aside a fern, and there they are, the Cottingley fairies, those tiny creatures captured in photographs that sparked one of the strangest debates of the late Victorian and Edwardian years. The story begins not in London's gaslit sprawl, but in the Yorkshire countryside in 1917, just at the tail end of the Victorian influence. Two girls, Frances Griffiths, aged 9, and her 16-year-old cousin Elsie Wright, were tired of being scolded for coming home with wet shoes. They claimed they'd been to see fairies at the bottom of the garden down by the beck. To prove it, Elsie borrowed her father's camera, a rather bulky thing for a child to handle, and returned with a photograph that would shake the world. In the image, Frances sits serenely on the grass while 4 little winged beings dance before her. Now you glance at that photo with modern eyes and think, those are cut-out drawings, right? The wings look like cardboard. But in 1917, and later when the photos were made public in 1919, the impact was extraordinary. Photography was still considered a near magical medium. If the camera caught something, well, it must be there. People didn't yet speak casually about Photoshop, so the photographs were hailed as evidence, perhaps even proof, that fairies, those elusive sprites of folklore, really did flit through English gardens. It wasn't just the public who got caught up in the spell. The famous author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, became the fairies' most prominent advocate. Irony of ironies, the man who gave the world the supreme rational detective was himself enchanted by these improbable images. Doyle published an article in the Strand magazine declaring the photos genuine, insisting they were evidence of psychic phenomena. To him, the fairies were a sign that the unseen world, the spiritual dimension, was real, and that mankind was on the cusp of uncovering hidden truths. Historians still argue whether Doyle's embrace of the fairies was naive or deliberate. Some believe he genuinely wanted to believe in a world beyond industrial smog and wartime horror. Others think he may have quietly known the photos were suspect but championed them anyway, as a way of comforting a society grieving from the carnage of the First World War. After all, wouldn't it be soothing to imagine gentle, magical beings sharing the earth with us, instead of gas masks and artillery shells? The controversy spread like wildfire. Newspapers debated endlessly. Spiritualist societies seized on the fairies as validation for their séances and ectoplasmic visions. Skeptics scoffed, claiming it was all children's mischief. But the photographs were tricky. experts of the day examined the negatives and declared there was no evidence of tampering. No strings, no double exposure, they said. Which technically was true. The photos were untouched. The trick lay in the props. You imagine Elsie and Francis cutting out illustrations from a popular book of fairy tales, propping them up with hat pins in the grass, and arranging themselves very seriously before the lens. They weren't sophisticated hoaxers. They were bored children who enjoyed playing along with a game that spiraled out of their control. For decades the pair maintained their story, even as they grew into adulthood. Only late in life, in the 1980s, did they finally admit the truth, that 4 of the photographs were staged. But Francis, even then, insisted that one of the pictures, the 5th, was real. That sliver of doubt lingers still, like a glimmer in the dark. What makes this tale so distinctly Victorian is not just the photographs, but the hunger behind them. This was a culture balanced uneasily between science and superstition. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species only half a century before, shaking the theological foundations of Europe. Meanwhile, industrial progress filled cities with smoke and clamour, making the pastoral idyll of fairy glens more appealing than ever. For every scientist demanding evidence, there was a housewife or factory worker dreaming of something enchanted, something delicate untouched by soot. The fairies answered that longing, and there's a quirky little side note. While the Cottingley photos are the famous ones, they weren't the only evidence of fairies circulating in Victorian times. Throughout the 19th century, amateur naturalists swore they had seen tiny winged bodies preserved in jars, or found small footprints near woodland streams. One Victorian showman even displayed a supposed mummified fairy, which looked suspiciously like a taxidermied bat with human features glued on. People lined up and paid pennies just to squint at it under a glass dome. You crouch now beside the Cottingley Beck, the water burbling as it slips over stones, the greenery pressing close on both sides. The air smells of damp earth and wild garlic. If you lean just so, you could almost believe that movement at the edge of your vision is not a moth, but a fairy shifting shyly out of sight. You know, of course, it's probably imagination, or maybe just the fact that you're listening for wings, but isn't that the heart of the mystery? When evidence is slim, desire fills in the gaps, and here's where you can't help but laugh softly at the contradiction. Victorians, those champions of logic and empire, built railways across continents and devised elaborate sanitation systems, yet many still gasped at the possibility of pixie wings. It's as if the harder they tried to dominate nature, the more they longed to believe in magic. You might say it's like a modern engineer who still knocks on wood before boarding a flight. Rationality and superstition rarely travel separately. They're cabin mates in the human mind. The Cottingley fairies may have been cardboard and ink, but they fluttered on currents much stronger than paper. They carried with them the yearning of a weary people for wonder, the eagerness of a wounded world to believe that something gentle might still exist. And though the truth has long since been confessed, the photos remain strangely powerful. Look at them today and you'll feel it. Not certainty, not proof, but that delicious lingering question mark. So you close your eyes, and for a moment you hear the rustle of wings, high-pitched laughter carried on the wind, and the shimmer of something darting between the leaves. When you open them again, only the quiet beck and the smell of moss remain. The fairies are gone, or maybe they were never there. You leave behind the whisper of wings in that Yorkshire garden, letting the laughter of supposed fairies fade into the rustle of leaves. The air thickens once again, carrying you not into the woods but into the crowded, uneven streets of Victorian towns. Here the smells are less enchanting. coal smoke, damp wool, fried fish from a street vendor. And among the noise of cartwheels and the rattle of shop shutters, you hear something else. Feet. Dozens of feet stamping, sliding and tapping in unison, as though possessed by an unseen fiddler. You've wandered into a Victorian fascination with one of history's strangest medical and folkloric puzzles, the mysterious outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing. Now, the original dancing plague most famously struck Strasbourg in 1518, when people suddenly took to the streets and danced for days, some until they collapsed or died. Centuries later, Victorians, with their appetite for both science and spectacle, found themselves haunted by reports of similar, if smaller, outbreaks. The age may have been defined by steam engines and telegram wires, but superstition and rumour still thrived, especially when something inexplicable touched a community. You picture a small English mill town in the 1840s. The textile machines clatter like metal giants, drowning out almost every other sound. Then one afternoon, a girl working at her loom suddenly begins to twitch, her arms jerking, her legs stamping in wild rhythm. She cannot stop. Soon, other girls catch the motion, as if the spasms are contagious. Before long, the workshop floor echoes with the sound of pounding feet. Supervisors, bewildered, shout orders, but nothing halts the frenzy. Some claim it is St. Vitus's dance, an old term for what we now recognise as Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder linked to rheumatic fever. Others mutter that it is possession, punishment, or mass hysteria. Historians still argue whether these Victorian echoes of the medieval plague were medical in origin or psychological contagion. Some accounts describe sufferers trembling as if struck by invisible lightning. Others insist they saw young people laughing uncontrollably while their limbs flailed beyond their command. You can almost hear the clashing explanations. Doctors scribbling earnest diagnoses while clergymen mutter prayers, and neighbours whispering about witches. One particularly odd tidbit comes from the north of England, where in the 1850s a local newspaper reported that a group of schoolchildren began dancing in their classroom. The episode escalated so quickly that parents rushed in, some convinced a malevolent spirit had taken hold. The teacher, desperate, began reciting scripture over the children. The dancing slowed, and eventually the frenzy passed. Was it exhaustion? Was it suggestion? Or did the ritual itself act as a kind of hypnotic release? The record doesn't say. It simply leaves you with that image. A smoky, gaslit classroom. Small boots thudding on a wooden floor until silence returns. Of course, Victorians had a love-hate relationship with dancing in general. In the ballrooms of London and Bath, a waltz could spark scandal because of the unseemly closeness of partners. In working-class taverns, jigging to fiddles was common, though often disapproved of by moralists. So the idea of dancing breaking out in the wrong place, factories, schools, even churches, was alarming, as though joy itself had become a disease. Imagine the horror of a Sunday service disrupted by a young man suddenly jigging in the aisle, while the preacher thundered about sin. But here's where you chuckle. Picture it. A prim Victorian matron, bonnet tied tightly, seeing her neighbours leaping like puppets. Would she faint? Would she join in? Or would she scold them even as they danced past her garden gate? The Victorians prided themselves on restraint, so nothing seemed more dangerous than the loss of bodily control, especially in public. There is also the more sinister layer, fear of women's bodies. Many outbreaks centred on groups of young women in factories or schools. Male doctors wrote long-winded reports about female nervousness and hysteria, as though entire communities of girls could be overtaken by fragility at once. Yet modern scholars point out how convenient such labels were. Blaming hysteria kept deeper issues: exhausting labour, poor diet, unventilated workrooms, neatly ignored. You can't help but wonder, were these dancing fits less about possession and more about protest? Bodies rebelling against the grind of the Industrial Revolution? Still, not all accounts can be brushed aside so easily. In continental Europe, Victorian travellers reported stumbling upon remote villages where, on certain feast days, processions turned into near uncontrollable frenzies. Music would begin softly, then swell until participants danced themselves ragged, foaming at the mouth, collapsing only when dawn broke. To the outsider, it looked like a sickness. To the locals, it was tradition, catharsis, a link to something older than science could measure. You pause now in the middle of a cobblestone street. Around you the lamps flicker, casting halos of gold against the fog. At first you hear only the clip-clop of a horse, then, faintly, the rhythmic pounding of feet. More and more until it surrounds you, shoes against stone echoing from walls, overlapping in strange polyrhythms. You see faces in the gloom, pale, wide-eyed, smiling and grimacing all at once. Their arms jerk, their skirts whirl, the frenzy builds. Your own foot taps before you realise it. That is the unnerving pull of the dancing plague. It beckons you to join in. Whether it was chorea, epilepsy, ergot poisoning from bad rye, or collective hysteria, the fact remains that whole groups of people once lost themselves to compulsive dance. Victorians catalogue these outbreaks with a mixture of fear and fascination, never certain whether they were witnessing illness, sin, or spectacle. And you, standing amid the echo, feel the same uncertainty. One thing is sure: the mystery endures. Even today, modern medicine can't fully explain the medieval dancing plagues or their Victorian cousins. Mass psychogenic illness, environmental toxins, or some quirk of the human nervous system we've yet to uncover. Whatever the cause, the image remains burned into history. A crowd of ordinary people seized by rhythm, stamping their lives away under the gaze of a startled world. So when next you tap your foot unconsciously to a tune, spare a thought for those forgotten dancers of the Victorian age. They may have been frightened, mocked, or misunderstood, but in that strange fever of movement, they carried forward an unanswered riddle that refuses to sit still. You shake off the echo of pounding feet, ears still ringing with the phantom rhythms, and wander deeper into the fog of Victorian London. The city never quite sleeps, but at certain hours it feels as though its streets are ruled by whispers. The lamplight pools in golden puddles, leaving long corridors of darkness between. And in those shadows, Victorians feared they might meet not thieves or beggars, but something worse: a ghost. One story, retold with relish through the 19th century, came from the district of Hammersmith, where a haunting grew so real it ended with blood on the cobblestones. The tale began decades earlier, in 1803, but Victorians loved it too much to let it fade. Residents of Hammersmith, then a small but growing suburb, complained of a phantom roaming the graveyard. Witnesses described a tall, pale figure, draped in white, gliding silently among the tombstones. Some swore they saw horns sprouting from its head. Others insisted it had glowing eyes. In taverns and parlours, the ghost was said to be the restless spirit of a suicide, doomed to walk until absolved. The story grew with every retelling. People walked home in pairs, shopkeepers locked up earlier, and children were threatened into obedience. Behave, or the Hammersmith ghost will take you. It sounds like classic campfire material, until you remember that Victorians were deeply superstitious. Many believed spirits could linger if denied a proper burial or if death came through violence. Ghost lore wasn't entertainment, it was part of the landscape. So when sightings mounted, panic was inevitable. Even men considered practical confessed to chills when walking past the churchyard at night. Among those unsettled was Francis Smith, a tax collector. On a frigid January evening in 1804, determined to protect his neighbours, Smith armed himself with a shotgun and went hunting for the ghost. Imagine him now, boots crunching frost, breath clouding in the air, nerves stretched taut. In the dim light he spotted a figure in white approaching. Without hesitation he raised his gun and fired. The figure collapsed instantly. It was no ghost. It was Thomas Millwood, a local bricklayer known for wearing a white linen work outfit, trousers, shirt, and an apron that shone in the moonlight. Millwood had been warned before to wear a cloak at night so as not to be mistaken for the apparition. He hadn't, and now he was dead. The case that followed fascinated Victorians for decades. Smith was tried for murder, though many argued he had acted in good faith, believing himself to be shooting at a spirit. The jury, torn between sympathy and law, first found him guilty of manslaughter. The judge, however, insisted on a stricter reading. Killing a man in such circumstances was still murder. Smith was sentenced to death, though he was later pardoned. Still, the central question lingered. Could belief in a ghost excuse a killing? Historians still argue whether the trial was about law or about the power of superstition. This strange episode became a touchstone for later Victorians. The idea that a ghost panic could escalate to real violence was both thrilling and unsettling. Newspapers dredged up the Hammersmith ghost whenever new spectral sightings were reported, as though to remind readers that fear itself could be deadly. Meanwhile, ballads and broadsheets spread a more sensational version. A man tricked by the devil into shooting his neighbour. But the story also revealed something deeper about the era. Even in a century of progress, railways, telegraphs, electric lights, people still looked over their shoulders for spirits. You might laugh now at the thought of a shotgun-toting ghost hunter, but then again, how many of your own fears are rooted more in story than in fact? Think about that time you checked the closet, or left a light on in the hallway just in case. Victorians were no different, only their closets were full of tales about suicides haunting graveyards. And here's a quirky twist. In the decades after the incident, pranksters in London and other towns took to dressing in white sheets to terrify passers-by. They called themselves ghosters or bogeymen. Some wore masks, some painted their faces with phosphorescent paint that glowed in the dark. Authorities tried to crack down, but the fad persisted. The irony is sharp. People feared the supernatural, and others exploited that fear for fun. You can almost picture a group of young men cackling in an alley after sending a merchant sprinting away in terror. You pause now in the Hammersmith churchyard itself, the damp earth soft beneath your boots, frost glittering on the railings. The silence is thick, broken only by the occasional flap of a crow's wings. You imagine Smith, heart hammering, levelling his weapon at what he thought was a ghost. And for just a moment, in the corner of your eye, you think you see a pale figure leaning against a gravestone. By the time you turn, there is nothing there, only a twist of fog, pale as linen curling away into the night. The Hammersmith ghost remains one of those curious Victorian fascinations, a reminder that fear is powerful, that belief shapes action, and that even in a city of millions, shadows can carry more weight than facts. It is a mystery not of what happened. We know who died and how, but of why human beings are so quick to believe in what they cannot see. Perhaps you'd like to think we've moved past that, and yet, even now, if you walk alone past a graveyard at night, your eyes will dart, your pace will quicken, and you'll swear something unseen is following close behind. You step out of the Hammersmith churchyard, shaking the frost from your coat, and follow the narrow lanes back toward the heart of Victorian London. The city feels different now, not haunted by ghosts exactly, but by whispers. The gas lamps flicker, the fog curls close to the cobblestones, and you notice men slipping into meeting rooms above taverns, their faces half hidden under hats. The Victorians loved to talk about ghosts, yes, but they were equally obsessed with secrets of a more earthly kind. Secret societies, clandestine gatherings, and cryptic codes scratched into letters or carved into wood. If the ghost stories kept them looking over their shoulders, these secret brotherhoods made them wonder what lurked behind closed doors. Freemasonry was perhaps the most famous of these societies. Founded long before Victoria's reign, the Masons had already built a reputation for secrecy, elaborate rituals, and strange symbols carved into buildings. In the 19th century they flourished, drawing in politicians, businessmen, and even members of the aristocracy. Their meeting halls, lit by candles and decorated with compasses, squares, and mysterious all-seeing eyes, stirred curiosity and suspicion alike. To be a Mason was to belong to a network that could open doors, offer protection, and whisper promises of advancement. But to outsiders, it was unnerving. What exactly were they doing in those smoky rooms while the rest of the city slept? Historians still argue whether Freemasonry was genuinely powerful or merely theatrical. Did its members truly conspire to shape politics and empire, or was it mostly a boys' club with secret handshakes and fancy aprons? The ambiguity was the point. The less the public knew, the more the imagination filled in. And Victorians, remember, had a talent for imagination. But Masonry was only one thread in a wider tapestry. There were the Rosicrucians, who claimed hidden knowledge of alchemy and the divine. There were the Oddfellows, whose ceremonies involved blindfolds and oaths. And then there were more eccentric groups, societies of spiritualists who gathered in parlors to test automatic writing, or scientific clubs that blurred into occult experimentation. The Victorians, balanced precariously between science and superstition, found the boundary porous. One moment a man was studying electromagnetism, the next he was wondering whether a medium's table rapping was connected to invisible forces. A quirky little tidbit comes from a small London society calling itself the Ghost Club, founded in 1862. It drew intellectuals, clergy, and even famous authors into discussions about hauntings, psychic phenomena, and life after death. Charles Dickens himself was a member for a time. Imagine Dickens, the chronicler of grimy London streets, sipping tea in a shadowy room while debating whether spirits were real. That's the Victorian paradox. A society that built railways across continents, but still whispered about fairies and phantoms after dark. And then there were the codes. Secret societies thrived on them, and so did ordinary Victorians who wanted to play spy. Newspapers occasionally published ciphers, daring readers to solve them. Amateur cryptographers created elaborate substitution alphabets, swapping letters for symbols that looked like stars, triangles, or little sketches of animals. Even lovers adopted codes, sliding notes in envelopes filled with cryptic shorthand so strict fathers couldn't guess the meaning. If you think texting in emojis is modern, picture a Victorian girl sending her beau a note covered in drawings of roses, birds, and moons, each carrying hidden significance. One particularly baffling code that made its way into Victorian law was found in an old manuscript that eventually became known worldwide, the Voynich manuscript. Though rediscovered properly in the 20th century, rumours of such indecipherable texts circulated among Victorian collectors. Handwritten in a script no one could translate, its pages filled with odd plants and naked figures bathing in tubes, it captivated scholars. Was it the work of an alchemist? A hoax? A guidebook from another world? Even now no one knows. Victorians who saw such works often treated them with reverence, as if holding a relic from a forgotten civilization. Imagine yourself now slipping into a lodge room above a London pub. The smell of pipe smoke is heavy. The wood-panelled walls glint with candlelight. A dozen men stand in a circle, reciting oaths you cannot quite hear. On the table lies a book, its pages covered with symbols you don't recognise. Diamonds, interlocking circles, spirals that seem to move if you stare too long. One man slides a paper toward you. On it is a message in code, daring you to decipher it. Do you try? Or do you fold it quietly, pretending you understand, afraid that a wrong answer might mark you an outsider? Victorian society itself was a kind of code, layers of etiquette, hidden meanings in dress and behaviour, the ever-present question of who knew what and who was excluded. Secret societies simply dramatised that reality. They gave form to the suspicion that someone, somewhere, was always pulling strings. And here's a light-hearted thought. Imagine if one of those Victorian code makers looked ahead and saw the modern internet, with people arguing about conspiracy theories in all caps on message boards. They'd probably feel right at home. Swap the candles for glowing screens and not much has changed. So you leave the meeting room, stepping back into the foggy night. Behind you, the murmurs continue, muffled by thick walls. You glance at the folded slip of coded paper in your pocket. Its symbols seem to shimmer in the lamplight, as though daring you to keep their secret, or to risk unravelling it. Either way, you can't shake the sense that the Victorians were right about one thing. Sometimes the world is ruled less by what is said than by what is hidden. The fog presses in on you as you step deeper into the city's veins, the streets narrow and damp, echoing with the clip of horse hooves muffled by mist. Victorian London is a place where mystery clings like soot to every brick. Tonight, it feels particularly suffocating, as though the fog itself might be hiding secrets. People who walked into it and never returned. The Victorians were fascinated and frightened by the idea of vanishing without a trace. In a society obsessed with order, punctuality, and recording every detail in ledgers, there was nothing more unsettling than someone, or an entire ship, simply gone. You start with Benjamin Bathurst, a diplomat who walked into history by disappearing from it. Though his case happened in 1809, decades before Victoria took the throne, Victorians retold it endlessly. Bathurst was in Prussia during the tense years of Napoleon's campaigns. One evening he stopped at an inn, walked out to inspect his horses, and then, poof, he was never seen again. His cloak, sword, and hat were found. His body? Not a hint. Some said spies killed him. Others thought thieves dragged him into the woods. Then the stranger theories crept in, that he slipped into another dimension, or was plucked by something not of this earth. Victorians adored those speculations. Even now, historians still argue whether Bathurst met a mundane but messy death, or whether his story really is the stuff of science fiction. But if Bathurst was one man, the Mary Celeste was a whole crew. In 1872, this American merchant ship was discovered adrift near the Azores. The cargo of industrial alcohol was intact, food and water enough for months still stored neatly. The captain's cabin showed no struggle, yet every sailor and passenger was gone. A lifeboat was missing, but no distress signals, no storm damage, just an empty vessel rocking in the sea. Victorians could not resist imagining the worst. Sea monsters dragging men overboard, ghosts rising from the hold, or pirates with the peculiar habit of stealing only people. Arthur Conan Doyle made the story even more dramatic in his fictionalized version, which of course convinced many readers it was all fact. Modern theories point to alcohol fumes leaking from barrels, sparking panic and a rushed evacuation. But honestly, doesn't the idea of a phantom wave sound more fun? London itself produced quieter but equally eerie vanishings. Take the servant girls who came from villages to work in townhouses. Thousands migrated every year, but every so often one disappeared. Employers told police she must have run away, but no one could prove otherwise. Some girls likely sought independence, reinventing themselves in a metropolis where no one asked questions. Others probably met darker ends in alleys, brothels, or the clutches of men who saw them as disposable. Newspapers dramatise such cases, painting them as morality tales. For respectable families, it confirmed their fears that the city was a hungry beast, swallowing innocence whole. One of the quirkiest tales that made the rounds was of a man in London who allegedly vanished mid-stride on a crowded street. Eyewitnesses swore they saw him lift his hat to a friend, adjust his collar, and then dissolve into nothing. Perhaps it was invention, perhaps drunken exaggeration, perhaps a very skilled pickpocket distracting the crowd. Still, the rumour spread, for Victorians loved the thought that you could simply fall through reality. It matched their experiments with mesmerism, séances, and ether. What if the boundary between worlds was thinner than anyone realised? And then there's the mystery of the lost Franklin expedition, though we touched on it earlier with Arctic ghosts. Two ships, the Erebus and Terror, set out in 1845 to chart the Northwest Passage. They never returned. For years only scraps of evidence surfaced. A note here, a skeleton there. Some survivors' accounts suggested starvation, madness, even cannibalism. Victorians back home clung to hope before the mystery hardened into legend. Imagine the horror of families waiting by the window for decades, straining for letters that would never arrive. The theme repeats again and again. In a time when record-keeping improved, railways ran on timetables, and telegrams zipped across wires, disappearances became even more disturbing. To vanish in medieval England might mean you died in a ditch and no one wrote it down. But to vanish in the Victorian age was an affront to progress, a defiance of the idea that everything could be tracked, numbered and known. Picture yourself now on a creaking Thames bridge at midnight. You hear footsteps behind you, steady, unhurried. You glance over your shoulder. A man in a bowler hat? A woman with a parasol? No, only fog. The footsteps stop. The silence that follows is louder than sound itself. You wonder, did you imagine it? Or did someone just slip into the mist forever? Another name on the city's endless list of vanishing acts. Historians still argue whether these mysteries were truly extraordinary or simply products of human error. Bathurst might have been mugged. The Mary Celeste crew might have fled a leaking hold. Servants may have reinvented themselves in anonymity. But explanations never carry the same weight as the mystery itself. It's the unanswered questions that linger, haunting generation after generation. And here's your wry Victorian-flavoured joke. If one of those lost souls suddenly popped into modern London after 150 years, they wouldn't gasp at skyscrapers or electric lights. No, their first words would probably be, "Good heavens, where are the chimneys?" The Victorians told disappearance tales because they reflected their own anxieties about losing control, about the fragility of identity, about the terrifying possibility that progress could not explain everything. And so, every missing sailor, every absent maid, every vanishing man became a legend, retold by firelight sewn into penny dreadfuls, whispered across fog-choked streets. As you walk on, you can't shake the eerie sense that somewhere just beyond sight, those lost Victorians are still wandering, forever missing, forever present in the mist. The fog rolls behind you like a curtain closing on the last mystery, but ahead, another glow pulls you in. This time it isn't the cold gleam of gas lamps or the steady lantern of a carriage, but a warm, flickering light spilling through the curtains of a respectable townhouse. You draw closer, press your hand to the cool glass and peer in. A dozen Victorians sit stiffly around a polished mahogany table, hands joined, eyes closed, lips murmuring. One candle burns low, dripping wax like slow tears, and a woman at the head of the table tilts back her chin as though she might swallow the air itself. You've stumbled into the great séance craze of the 19th century. Half parlour game, half sacred ritual, and one of the strangest obsessions of the Victorian age. It all began, in many ways, across the Atlantic in the 1840s with the Fox sisters, 3 young women from Hydesville, New York. They claimed they could summon the dead through mysterious rappings, knocks that answered yes or no questions. Word spread like fire on dry grass. Soon their spirit communication was the talk of 2 continents. By the time the phenomenon crossed the ocean, Victorians were already primed for it. This was the era of the telegraph, after all. Why not a telegram from the afterlife? If a wire could carry your words across oceans, perhaps unseen wires could stretch into eternity. And so parlours across London transformed into stages. Curtains were drawn, lamps extinguished, and tables prepared. Families and friends gathered, both for solemn remembrance and for the thrill of the unknown. Mediums claim the ability to channel the voices of the dead, their eyes rolling back, their voices changing timbre as they spoke with uncanny familiarity. Sometimes the séances were intimate, a grieving mother clutching at any scrap of comfort. Other times they were flamboyant with trumpet-playing spirits, luminous ectoplasm trailing from mouths, or even full-bodied apparitions drifting across the drawing room. Queen Victoria herself attended séances, especially after the death of Prince Albert. Rumour insists she tried to summon his spirit, though whether she truly believed or simply sought solace remains uncertain. Historians still argue whether she was genuinely drawn to spiritualism, or whether the royal flirtation with séances was exaggerated by society gossip. Either way, the idea that the most powerful woman in the world might dim the lamps and listen for ghostly knocks gave spiritualism a thrilling legitimacy. Yet, it wasn't only royals who fell under the spell. The middle classes embraced spiritualism with zeal. Imagine the scene. A stuffy parlour crowded with clerks, governesses and gentlemen of commerce, all holding hands as the gaslights dim. A faint tapping on the table begins. 1, 2, 3. The medium announces, "The spirit wishes to speak." The guests lean in, trembling between scepticism and hope. Even if you suspected trickery, wasn't it worth suspending disbelief for a moment, if only to feel that lost loved one brushing past your shoulder? Of course, fraud was rampant. Investigators caught mediums hiding bells on wires, blowing horns through concealed tubes, and stuffing chewed muslin into their mouths to create ectoplasm. Spirit photography, which promised to reveal ghostly forms on glass plates, often turned out to be clever double exposures. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, sought to sift truth from deception. They debunked plenty of charlatans, but intriguingly, they also found cases they could not explain away so easily. And that, of course, only fueled more speculation. One of the quirkiest figures of the movement was Daniel Douglas Home, the Scottish medium famous for levitation. Dozens of witnesses, including respected aristocrats, swore they saw him rise into the air during séances, even drifting out a third-story window and back in through another. No wires, no platform, no trapdoors, at least none that anyone could detect. Skeptics insisted it was sleight of hand. Believers claimed it was proof of unseen forces. Historians still argue whether Home was the greatest magician of his age, or whether something genuinely uncanny occurred in those candlelit rooms. As you sit in on one of these gatherings, let's be honest, you weren't about to resist. You feel the cool surface of the table beneath your palms. A soft breeze brushes your cheek, though the windows are closed. The medium begins to hum, her voice low and throaty as the candle flame sputters. Suddenly the table gives a jolt, just enough to make your heart leap. Laughter bubbles up from one guest, nervous and sharp. "Don't be afraid," the medium whispers. "They are here." You glance beneath the table, expecting to find a clever foot pressing upward. But the space is empty, save for your own restless shoes. The allure of spiritualism was about more than spectacle. It offered Victorians something deeper: comfort. Remember, this was an age of high mortality, when cholera swept through crowded neighbourhoods, when childbirth often ended in death, when wars dragged sons and brothers into unmarked graves. Almost every family carried grief. Spiritualism promised not only entertainment, but the assurance that death was not final. A knock, a whisper, a ghostly photograph, these were fragile bridges across the abyss of loss. Still, not everyone was convinced. Charles Dickens, ever the sharp observer, mocked spiritualists as gullible. Scientists rolled their eyes at ectoplasm and ghost trumpets, and yet even skeptics were curious enough to attend séances, if only to expose fraud, or to confirm that maybe, just maybe, something unexplainable lingered beyond the gaslit world. Here's your modern chuckle. Imagine a Victorian medium transported into the 21st century. They'd skip the candlelit parlours and set up a TikTok account instead. No muslin needed, just a ring light and some glitchy filters. Same eerie whispers, same captivated audience, only with more hashtags. As you leave the séance, the guests still clutch hands, waiting for one last knock. The medium's eyes flutter open, sweat beading on her brow. Behind you, the parlour fades, but the sound lingers. A faint tap-tap on the window, too soft to dismiss. You step back into the fog with the uneasy thought that perhaps the spirits have followed you, curious to see what secrets you'll uncover next. The fog curls around your coat again as you step from the séance parlour into the brisk night air. You half expect the tapping to follow you, but instead another sound rises, a whirring, clicking, grinding noise. You glance down a narrow lane and find yourself in a cluttered workshop, the kind where soot blackens the beams and the air smells of oil and hot metal. Here, Victorian science and invention hum restlessly, every table piled with brass gears, glass tubes, and half-finished contraptions. If the séance promised mystery, this laboratory promises answers, or at least attempts at them. The 19th century was as much the age of rational discovery as it was of spiritualist wonder. For every medium promising to summon the dead, there was a scientist determined to map the living world, to measure, weigh, and catalogue. Charles Darwin, with his quiet voice and endless patience, pieced together the great puzzle of evolution, tracing life back through countless ages. His 1859 book on the origin of species landed like a cannonball in polite society, challenging long-held beliefs. Drawing rooms buzzed with debate. Were humans descended from apes, or was Darwin meddling with blasphemy? Clergymen denounced him from pulpits, but scientists argued his evidence was too meticulous to dismiss. Meanwhile, other inventors tinkered in dusty workshops not unlike the one you now wander through. Michael Faraday, the bookbinder's apprentice turned experimental genius, showed that electricity and magnetism were not separate forces but two sides of the same coin. His lectures at the Royal Institution drew crowds of eager Londoners, children perched on benches, all gasping as sparks leapt between coils. He made electricity not just a mystery of the heavens, but something you might one day switch on with ease. Not far behind him came James Clerk Maxwell, with equations that seemed at first too abstract for the average Victorian to grasp. His work on electromagnetic waves would eventually give rise to radio, radar, and all the wireless marvels of the modern world. Imagine explaining to a Victorian gentleman that one day people would whisper into little boxes and be heard across continents. He'd either call you mad or ask where he could invest. But the Victorians weren't only mapping invisible forces, they were also peering deep inside the human body. This was the golden age of medical breakthroughs. Anesthesia, first demonstrated publicly in the 1840s, transformed surgery from a nightmare of screaming patients to something survivable. Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, marched into military hospitals during the Crimean War and demanded cleanliness, fresh air and decent food, principles so basic now, but revolutionary then. Mortality rates plummeted, and nursing was reshaped from menial labour into a respected profession. Public health, too, became an obsession. In the 1850s, physician John Snow traced a cholera outbreak in London to a single contaminated water pump in Soho. His removal of the pump handle is now legendary, a simple act that proved disease could be prevented by understanding its true source. It was science in action, and it saved countless lives. Still, not every Victorian invention was quite so noble. You glance at a peculiar contraption on a nearby bench, a brass helmet with dangling wires and straps. This was an electric corset, one of many bizarre medical devices Victorians hoped would cure ailments from hysteria to indigestion. Other oddities included vibrating chairs, patent health belts, and tonics laced with opium or arsenic. The line between science and quackery was often as foggy as the streets outside. At the same time, inventions pushed forward with astonishing speed. The typewriter began to click in offices. Photography captured not only portraits but also crime scenes and battlefields. The first synthetic dyes turned fabric into brilliant shades never before seen. Even leisure changed. Bicycles rattled along country roads, while penny dreadfuls, cheap sensational booklets, thrilled young readers with tales of highwaymen, monsters and detectives. Perhaps the strangest spectacle of all was the Victorian obsession with exhibitions. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held inside the Crystal Palace, was the pinnacle. Imagine walking into a glittering glass structure larger than anything the world had ever seen. Sunlight pouring through 300,000 panes of glass. Inside, the treasures of empire dazzled. Indian jewels, Canadian furs, Australian gold, and inventions from across the globe. Steam engines hissed, textile machines roared, and crowds gawked at wonders like the world's largest diamond. Prince Albert beamed with pride, for this was not just a fair, it was a statement that Britain stood at the forefront of progress. Yet even amid all this optimism, scepticism lingered. Some feared machines would strip workers of their livelihoods. Luddites had already smashed looms in earlier decades, and though the machine breaking had waned, the unease remained. Others worried that too much faith in science would erode faith in God. Newspapers debated whether Britain's greatness came from divine blessing or from clever engineers with oil-stained fingers. You, standing in the clamour of this workshop, notice a final detail. On a high shelf sits a small mechanical bird wound with a key. The inventor sets it gently on his palm and releases. The bird flutters, chirps, and flaps its brass wings, hovering just long enough to make your heart catch. Then it whirs down, silent again. The room erupts in applause. For the Victorians, moments like this felt like glimpses of a future where anything, flight, light, communication, even life after death might be conquered. And as you step back out into the fog, you can't help but think, perhaps the greatest séance of all wasn't in the parlour, but in the laboratory, where Victorians conjured invisible forces, not from spirits, but from nature itself. The gaslight flickers uneasily as you make your way through narrow, damp alleys of Whitechapel. The cobblestones are slick, the air sour with coal smoke and refuse, and somewhere in the distance a carriage rattles over uneven paving stones. This is the East End of London in the late 1880s, a place of overpopulation, poverty and whispered fear. Because it was here that a figure emerged, one of history's most infamous shadows, Jack the Ripper. You hear the murmurs before you see the posters nailed to brick walls, handbills warning women to stay vigilant, newspapers screaming headlines about another grisly murder. Between 1888 and 1891, at least 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were murdered in ways so brutal they shocked even a city hardened by daily crime. Police patrols grew frantic, journalists churned out lurid stories, and yet the killer slipped again and again into the fog. The facts are stark. The crimes took place in a tiny geographic area, in dimly lit streets filled with watchmen, hawkers and prostitutes. Investigators collected witness statements, examined bloodied alleyways, even brought in modern forensic science. But this was a world before DNA testing or crime scene photography as we know it. Detectives could do little more than draw diagrams, take measurements and speculate. Theories sprouted like mushrooms in damp soil. Some thought the killer was a butcher, his hands too skilled with knives to be a novice. Others swore it had to be a doctor, perhaps a surgeon with a taste for morbid precision. Still others whispered about royalty, secret societies, or foreign immigrants scapegoated in moments of panic. What set Jack the Ripper apart wasn't only his cruelty, it was his apparent performance. Letters signed Jack the Ripper flooded newspapers and police stations. One was smeared in red ink, another sent with half a human kidney. Scholars still argue whether any of these were genuine or simply the work of pranksters feeding the hysteria. Even at the time, detectives admitted the letters might be clever hoaxes, but the public was gripped. The name stuck, and the legend grew. The Ripper case also revealed the sensational power of the Victorian press. Cheap newspapers known as penny dreadfuls and illustrated broadsheets depicted the crimes in gruesome detail. For the first time, crime reporting reached a mass audience, blending fact and speculation until readers could scarcely tell them apart. Crowds gathered outside police stations demanding answers. Amateur sleuths sent in tips ranging from the plausible to the absurd. It was tabloid culture in its infancy, and Jack the Ripper was its unwilling star. One quirky detail often overlooked is the bloodhound's plan. Desperate for progress, police actually tried borrowing dogs to sniff out the killer. Imagine grim detectives tramping through East End alleys with hounds on leashes, hoping Victorian London's stink wouldn't overwhelm the poor animals' noses. Unsurprisingly, the scheme fizzled quickly. What makes the case endure is not simply the crimes, but the void left behind. The Ripper was never caught, his identity never confirmed. Dozens of suspects have been proposed: doctors, artists, Polish immigrants, even a royal prince. Each decade since has produced fresh theories. Some experts swear the case will never be solved. Others insist new forensic technology could still reveal the truth hidden in century-old evidence. Historians still argue whether the canonical 5 victims were the only ones, or whether the killer claimed more lives unnoticed in the chaos of East End poverty. And then there's the social mystery. Why this case, among so many murders of the Victorian era, lodged so firmly in the imagination? Part of the answer lies in contrast. While polite London strolled through glittering arcades and glass palaces, just a few miles east, women were living in overcrowded lodging houses, working streets where survival meant a shilling for a bed. The Ripper's crimes ripped open the stark inequality of the city, exposing wounds that could not be hidden under Empire's polished veneer. Even now, walking those same streets, where some original buildings still stand, you can feel the chill of unsolved history. You pass the 10 Bells pub, where some victims drank before their deaths, its sign creaking softly in the night air. You glance up at shadowed windows, half expecting a dark figure to appear. Every alley whispers a reminder. The Ripper was never caught. He, or she, could have melted into the crowd, lived an ordinary Victorian life and died in bed, taking the secret to the grave. As you step away from Whitechapel, the clamour of the city returns. Omnibuses rattle, newsboys shout, factories roar. Yet the mystery lingers, hanging like the fog. Jack the Ripper became not just a criminal, but a mirror reflecting society's fears about urban poverty, immigration, crime, and the limits of modern policing. And maybe that's why, more than a century later, you still lean forward when the story is told, as if the answer might finally reveal itself in some forgotten clue. But of course, it never does. That's the cruel magic of Victorian mysteries. The shadows stay just out of reach, the questions hang unanswered, and you're left staring into the fog, half hoping the truth never comes, because perhaps it's the not knowing that makes the story endure. The Thames glistens like black glass beneath the moon, and the embankment stones gleam wet with mist. You lean on the railing, the iron cool under your fingers, and the city feels hushed at last. Factories have quieted, carriages have dwindled, and the faint whistle of a night watchman echoes from far away. After wandering through so many alleys, parlours and workshops, you expect the mysteries to fade, but they don't. If anything, they seem sharper in the silence, like coins glinting faintly at the bottom of a fountain. The Victorians left you riddles, some deliberate, some accidental. Think back to spring-heeled Jack, bounding across rooftops, described by witnesses as a devil with fire breath and claws. Was he just an acrobat with a cruel sense of humour, a soldier testing experimental gear, or a phantom dreamt into being by overworked Londoners stumbling through smog? Historians still argue whether his legend began in truth or hysteria, and the fact that no one can quite settle it makes him leap eternal in memory, always one jump ahead. Then there were the phantom airships. Reports from the 1890s describe cigar-shaped craft gliding across the skies, decades before the Wright brothers ever lifted into the air. Some claimed inventors had achieved secret triumphs and hidden them from the world. Others blamed tired eyes, Venus, or simple exaggeration. Yet the accounts stretched from London to rural countryside, and once the idea of flying machines took hold, it refused to let go. Was it mass imagination? Or was someone somewhere tinkering with wings of wood and canvas, their work lost to history's shadows? Disappearances too haunt the era. The Mary Celeste sailed from New York with cargo and crew in 1872 and was found drifting, abandoned, meals half-eaten, charts scattered. No signs of struggle, no explanation. Theories abound: mutiny, piracy, storms, poisoned bread, even sea monsters. None hold tight enough. On land, stories of Londoners vanishing into the fog made headlines. Bodies never found, identities erased in an overcrowded city where anonymity was easy and crime common. Did the fog truly swallow them? Or were they swallowed by poverty, violence, and bureaucracy's blind spots? The silence lingers. And then there is grief, the invisible mystery woven through every parlour séance. Families gathered around tables, candles flickering, waiting for raps or whispers from the beyond. Were they dupes of clever mediums, or were they participants in a ritual of hope, willing to believe in illusion to soften the brutality of daily death? Historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely thought spirits tapped back, or whether they simply needed to imagine it. Perhaps the real mystery is not what was heard, but why it mattered so desperately. Even their inventions left riddles. The typewriter, hailed as progress, gave women new paths to work, but also sparked debates about propriety, respectability, and what it meant to be modern. The electric corset promised vitality, pulsing faint current across the body, but mostly delivered burns and disappointment. And the Crystal Palace, glittering with treasures of empire in 1851, stood as a monument to Victorian confidence, until it burned in 1936, its contents lost forever. Which marvels, which prototypes, which eccentric contraptions vanished with it? We can only guess. And always Jack the Ripper waits in the shadows of Whitechapel. The murders that shock the world remain unresolved, the killer faceless. Suspects range from butchers to princes, but no single name closes the file. The unanswered questions of his case keep historians writing, tourists walk in the alleys, and imaginations lingering over the fog. It is the most famous Victorian mystery precisely because it refuses to end. But perhaps that's the pattern. The Victorians catalogued beetles, fossils and stars, yet so many of their greatest stories resist cataloguing. They are like time capsules, sealed not with trinkets and coins, but with questions. Each mystery is an unopened box, daring you to try the lid. Tonight you've peeked inside many, and each one left you with more curiosity than closure. And maybe that's the point. Answers comfort, but mysteries inspire. They keep us leaning forward, ears pricked, hearts open to wonder. The Victorians lived in a world where science surged forward, but where gaps in knowledge felt like abysses. Instead of closing every gap, they left some cracks unsealed, and through those cracks the fog still creeps, inviting us to wonder what waits beyond. Now, as the river murmurs, you realise the questions aren't heavy anymore. They're simply there, folded into the night like whispers in a quilt. You don't need to solve them. You only need to acknowledge them, to marvel that people over a century ago puzzled at the same shadows you puzzle at now. The mysteries endure not because they must be solved, but because they remind you that history, like the Thames, always carries secrets in its depths. The lamps burn lower, the air grows cooler, and the city sleeps. And as you stand watching the river flow, You let the mysteries drift with it, sealed once more in time. They can wait. They will always wait. And now, the last embers of our journey flicker out. You've walked through gaslit alleys, pressed your ear against séance tables, and drifted with phantom airships across the starry night. You've stood on foggy docks beside ghost ships, and you've watched shadows stretch across Whitechapel without ever revealing their faces. The unanswered mysteries of the Victorian age still linger, but they no longer feel like burdens. They feel like lullabies of the past, humming softly in the dark. Let the pace slow now, each word like a candle burning lower, softer, smaller. You picture the River Thames once more, not rushing, not roaring, but flowing gently under the silver wash of moonlight. The city that once clattered with hoofbeats and factory bells has grown utterly quiet. The mysteries remain, tucked into the folds of history, but you no longer feel the urge to chase them. Instead, you let them pass by, as if you were watching faint lanterns drifting downstream. The people of that era lived, wondered, and struggled, just as you do. They reached for answers, often failed, and left their questions behind for us to puzzle over. And maybe, as you rest here, that's the real gift. Not solutions, but the reminder that humans have always dreamed into the darkness, always whispered into the unknown. So let your thoughts loosen, unspool, drift like threads of mist. There is no need to hold on to any detail, any debate, any shadow. Just let them dissolve into the night. The questions can wait. The mysteries can keep themselves company until morning. For now, close your eyes. Breathe deep. Let the hush of history settle into your chest like a blanket. Sleep well and dream gently.